Sulla costa meridionale dell'Inghilterra, a metà strada tra le bianche scogliere di Dover e le spiagge dei dinosauri, c'è Brighton, una delle più frizzanti località del paese, affacciata sulla Manica. Se oggi è così popolare, tanto da essere chiamata la cittadina più felice d'Inghilterra, lo deve a 3 fattori: la sua lunga spiaggia di sassi, il grande padiglione sul molo aperto nella metà del 1800 e la ferrovia che la collega in meno di un'oretta alla sua capitale. Qui è nato il cinema come lo conosciamo oggi, l'idea stessa delle inquadrature e le 1000 invenzioni dei suoi pionieri. E qui è ancora attiva la più vecchia sala cinematografica della nazione, la Duke of York, inaugurata nel 1910 dall'attrice Violet Melnot Wyatt. Ed è sempre qui, tra i suoi poco più di 200.000 abitanti, che vive con la sua famiglia il più importante illustratore inglese, Chris Riddell, che è molto più di un semplice disegnatore, copertinista, viaggiatore col suo taccuino di sketch, pungente vignettista politico per l'Observer. Ha lavorato da solo e con i più importanti scrittori e scrittrici inglesi, da Neil Gaiman a J.K. Rowling. Sono andato a incontrarlo nel suo studio, una casetta in fondo al giardino di casa, così come lo shed, il ritrovo degli attrezzi, in cui Roald Dahl scriveva sulle ginocchia i suoi racconti di paura. You were born in Cape Town in South Africa, after which you almost immediately returned to UK. So I can imagine you don't have any childhood memories of that city. But I notice you and your family have kept ties with Africa. Can you tell us something about your connection with Africa, if there are?
You're absolutely right. I have no early memories of Cape Town, and I was, I think, 18 months old, I think, when we left. But I have almost sort of cultural memories, because for me as a child growing up in England, South Africa was a vivid part of my childhood in terms of references. My parents used to speak, they're English-speaking South Africans, okay, but they were educated with Afrikaans as a second language. So when they didn't want us to know what they were talking about, they would speak in Afrikaans. So I was very aware of this very special language that I couldn't understand.
Secret language.
Very important, yes. Food, various sort of things that I remember. We never had barbecues because my parents had braais, which is the South African barbecue. So some of my school friends used to question, what do you mean a barbecue? I meant a braai. This very strange sort of iconography that we had. I remember loving avocado pears. Now, my schoolmates had no idea what they were. No one knew what avocado pears were back then. But of course, my parents, as South African, they would bring these avocado pears back with them, and we would, they were very precious, special things, not to be mashed up on a piece of toast.
Never.
No, very special. So there were a lot of references, and also my grandparents were there, and I had uncles, and my godfather was the Bishop of Port Elizabeth. Mm-hmm. So, all these sort of connections. I also had this complicated feeling about South Africa as a child, because I was so aware that my parents had left because of apartheid. Mm-hmm. They were politically active. They didn't want to bring up their children in the apartheid regime. And so they opposed it from abroad. They were one of many South Africans who left the country in protest, but continued to protest against it. So for me, politics in my house was about South African politics, okay, far more than it was about the UK politics. So I had quite a political upbringing, but it wasn't about the country I was living in, and that was an interesting disconnect as well. But I also had a profound shame associated with South Africa, because I knew it to be a country that was absolutely throughout the world looked down on and sort of frowned upon. And so I often wouldn't tell my school friends that I had any South African connections, particularly as a teenager. And then you saw the change begin. I remember the Soweto riots when I was at school and being completely sort of outraged and politically motivated as I saw the coverage in the UK press of the Soweto uprisings and the beginnings of what would finally lead to Nelson Mandela's freedom. And Nelson Mandela for me was this extraordinary figure that I only knew as that grainy black and white photograph that was Mandela as a young man. And so to me he was this otherworldly figure. Possibly Aslan. And then when I remember watching on television as he left prison and took the long walk to freedom, being utterly astounded that this mythic figure that I'd only ever imagined, never seen, more than the old news footage of him many years ago, there he was as he was then and walking towards us to speak. Nelson Mandela speaking. It was an extraordinary moment. Yeah. Subsequently, after the end of the apartheid regime, I took my children to South Africa as young children to visit relatives, to see my grandparents, and there was an extraordinary feeling that people knew me over there because of my relationship to my parents, had no idea what I did over here. So that wasn't an issue, they didn't know my work or anything. They just knew me as my father's son or my, mother's son. Yeah. And there was an extraordinary sense of sort of belonging to a society I'd never lived in, and picking up on all these lovely connections and the beautiful landscape and whatever, but also a real sort of sense of the division within that society and the extraordinary thing they were doing, trying to bring it together, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the attempt to really sort of unify this country. And then I went back many years after that, when my children were grown up. I went over as an author to visit schools, and I went to lots of fantastic schools all over the country. And the final visit was to a school in Alexandra Township. And the contrast between the haves and the have-nots was absolutely, there in its starkest terms. And I remember sort of a great sense of sorrow, in a sense of so much of that optimism, so much of that sort of sense of early sort of, change and things were going to get better, had dissipated during that time. And I was looking at a country where 30% were hugely empowered and 70% had almost nothing. Yeah. And I think in a way that's where we are now. And yet I have a huge love for this country I've never lived in, but has fueled my imagination in all sorts of ways. And I want to be optimistic about it. I want to feel things. Yeah, we have to, don't we? Particularly sort of in the world as we see it now. But it's an amazing country, and I'm sort of now very proud to have that connection. But I'm completely British in that sense. All my cultural references, although I have this in my sort of past, my references here are impeccably English, I'm afraid.
Yeah. In fact, you live in Brighton with your family. Can you tell us something about Brighton, your city, if you're your
Yes,
city?
I mean, it was a complete mistake. I wasn't meant to live in Brighton at all. I wasn't actually meant to go to art school in Brighton. I remember when I was at school, I went to a very traditional school where art was considered a sort of a remedial subject, something for people who weren't doing too well. They put them in the art room, and that's fine.
Draw something.
I was very conformist, and so I would, if the teacher told me to do something, I would do it and some. I was very eager to sort of fit in and not stand out. So what I did is I worked incredibly hard to just fit in. And the irritating thing is I kept sort of being picked on for things which I was like, no, please, no. I had two very sporting brothers at school with me. And so they assumed I would be very sporting, and I was okay. But they kept putting me into the school teams because they thought, well, he's got two, he must be the third one, he must work. And I said, no, I'm artistic, I like drawing. No, they wouldn't hear that. I had to play rugby, I had to play cricket, all that stuff, which I did because I wanted to fit in. They decided I really should go to a very good university because that was good for the school. That would make the school look very good. So they said, you should go to university. I said, yes, of course I will. I didn't want to. I just wanted to draw. And my art master at school, he was a lovely man called Jack Johnson. Yeah. And he said to me one day, he said, I hear you're up for going to university. I think I said, yes, they said I should do this. He said, why don't you go to art school? You like drawing. I said, could I? He said, well, I don't see why not. Why don't you? And so I went along to my local art school near where I lived, because I went to school in central London, but I lived in outside London, so we had a long journey in. Okay. But I went to my local art school and I said to them, I just had some work I'd done from school and I took it into my local art school. And I said, I know the term's about to start. I should have been going to university. Okay. I'd been accepted at the university. So I took this work into my local art school and I said, could I come and study here? And they looked at the work and said, yes, of course you can. Because I had a grant back then, there was money with me. So they said, yes, do. And I remember going back to school and saying, I've changed my mind, I'm going to go to my local art school. And my headmaster was so disappointed. And I loved it because I felt in that moment such a rebel. Yeah. I thought, look at me, I'm sort of fighting the system here. Really wasn't, but and so going to art school for me was this fantastic running away from all the academic stuff, all the, sort of the hard work, to do something I absolutely loved. And it was very important to me that my school disapproved. I really enjoyed that. And so I went to my local art school and it was a lovely sort of experience. So I did lots of different things just for a year. And then I saw an art school down the road to study for another 3 years. And I said to my tutor at Epsom School of Art and Design, I said, I want to go to Kingston Art School. And he said, oh, no, they don't like us. Because it was a rivalry, because there were two local schools, Epsom and Kingston. He said, no, they never accept students from us. He said, why don't you go down to Brighton? And I never thought of Brighton. I thought, well, no. I said, can I? He said, yes, why not? So I took the train down to Brighton and had a lovely interview and met this extraordinary man called Raymond Briggs. Illustrator. And he was a tutor at Brighton, and when I met Raymond, I thought, this is where I want to come. I want to be like
Brighton again.
This man. Yes, he taught in Brighton, and they accepted me, and I went to Brighton for 3 years, and had the most amazing time.
Good.
And I decided then I needed to leave, and I needed to go to London, and because this is what you do, and I went off to London, and had a really lovely time in London. All sorts of things happened, lots of adventures. I then went over to New York for about 6 months in New York. And then I came back and I thought it really is time to find somewhere to, permanent place to live. So we found a house, my wife and I. Yeah. We weren't yet married, but we were deciding that's what we wanted to do. And we found a house in London, this little house in London. In quite a sort of mixed area in London, quite interesting, but and then some friends invited us back to Brighton for supper, and we went down to see them, and we walked to where they lived through a square, this beautiful square on top of the hill called Montpellier Crescent. It's a sort of Georgian architecture, just beautiful, and we looked up and there was this gorgeous apartment with a balcony overlooking the green, and we saw a for sale sign. and we suddenly thought, do we want to live in a little house in London, or do we want to live there? And it was small, it wasn't a big apartment. But we decided then and there, even though we shouldn't live in Brighton because we were students, both my wife and I had been students there, that's not what you do. And so we rather shamefacedly admitted to all our friends we were moving back to Brighton.
Okay.
And we've been here ever since. It's just one of those strange things. It's never escaped.
Yeah,
I've loved it. I mean,
you can see Europe from the sea. So
that's always nice, that connection. When I moved to Brighton all those years ago, I was very young, I was very fashionable. I was absolutely, sort of part of the zeitgeist. I felt I really had things to say and really sort of, on the cusp of everything. Brighton was quite sort of down at heel, it sort of had seen better times, it was faded. And then what's happened is that I had children and I increased in size and eminence, and I slowly, so my fashionability sort of was doing that.
Okay.
And Brighton in the meantime was getting very, very attractive to lots of people from London, and its fashionability was doing that. And on the graph of fashionability, I was going that way, Brighton was going that way. We crossed in about, I think 1993 would be my,
the year.
And ever since then I've been going down, and Brighton is now so high up, it's so fashionable.
Yeah,
it shouldn't have people like me living here. But I refuse to leave.
Like Groucho Marx in the club. So,
yes.
Yeah. Speaking about masters and mentors, in more than one occasion you have declared your admiration for the work of Sir John Daniel, the first illustrator of Alice in Wonderland, one of your last book, and for Robinson. And you talk about your teacher, Raymond Briggs, here in Brighton. What purpose do mentors serve, and how does one relate to them when you're starting?
I think the role of mentors, I think, is so interesting, and I think it is absolutely at the heart for me of what illustration is, and possibly what art is in a way. The idea of passing on, of giving your insight or your example to another generation, to make of it what they will, but to sort of maybe, sort of pass on some sort of insights. And I've been very fortunate to have been taught by Raymond Briggs at Brighton Art School. Raymond was one of these sort of teachers who I often like to sort of describe Raymond as the opposite of the US Marine drill sergeant in Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. The sort of drill sergeant who breaks the recruits down in order to build them up into fighting machines. And Raymond was the opposite. He was never someone to sort of say to you, I think the phrase is to kill your darlings, so don't do that, this is the way to do it, stop all this childish stuff, here's what you do. He didn't do that. I mean, what he did, he was quietly encouraging.
Okay.
And so he would look at your work and he would find positive aspects and he would analyze, what you were doing, what he sort of was perceiving as your enthusiasms, and gently guiding you towards that. And I remember having tutorials with Raymond every Wednesday afternoon. I would take whatever I was working on and I would put it in front of Raymond, and he would look through these sketchbooks of half-formed ideas and these things that were, and he'd make a few comments, and then he would say, marvelous. Marvellous. And you would turn a page and look at something else, and he would say a few things, and he would say, marvellous.
Wow.
Marvellous. And each time he said marvellous,
your ego.
I would just, at the end of the sort of hour of talking and showing him, I would float out of the building, just feeling so elated and so encouraged, thinking, perhaps I can do this. If Raymond says it's marvellous, perhaps. I didn't quite believe it was marvellous. But because he said that, I felt empowered. You know, he passed that to me, that positivity. And so it made me continue. And I thought, I want to be like Raymond. I want to have a studio at the end of my garden. I want to be able to sort of come down here and dream up stories and make them into books the way that Raymond did. Wow. And so he taught me in a mentoring way, almost without teaching me, just by being Raymond. He imbued me with that. And when I talk to students now, I often, because I'm not a teacher, I've never taught in art schools, but I'm often invited in to visit. And so I'll go into...
As a master?
Who knows, but I like that title. As a master, I will go in and talk to students. And what I always do is ask to see their sketchbooks, and they'll take out sketchbooks and show me work. And I can see those are sketchbooks that art students have done for their tutors. And it'll be full of notes about what they're going to do and compositional sketch, all that sort of stuff, all very good. I'll say, yeah, that's fine, but where's your personal sketchbook? Yeah. Would you, something you don't show? And they always have one, and they'll shyly take it out and open it up. And I'll see
treasure.
Pages of dragons or pages of wizards and I say, you enjoy that, don't you? Oh, yes. I said, that's probably why you wanted to become yes. I say, go towards that. That's all very good, all that stuff, that's for the tutors, that's lovely. But you've got this thing, that's your enthusiasm, go towards that. And I think that's a passing on, in a way. And of course...
It's the lesson from Raymond.
It is. And also I think this idea of looking to the great illustrators of the past and enjoying what they are doing and bringing that, into your work as well. The great sense of being influenced by other minds, other talents. And we live in an age now where I see it as a golden age, in a way. People often worry about, the impact of the digital, impact of social media, impact of that on literature and on art, on illustration. I see huge positives in it because you can find so much. You can, if someone mentions a name, you can take out your phone and find that person's work and scroll through it and find this extraordinary stuff you might never have stumbled upon in the past. And I think that is an amazing opportunity. But I also say to students when I talk to them, take all that, but when you come to create something, put it to one side. Then see what you retain, because that's going to be your sort of style, your personality should come through. So it's this balancing. The mentoring, I think, is fantastic, but it must always be mediated through the imagination of the person who is mentored.
What's your favorite work within your vast collection of works, and why? And there is something you want to share with us?
Yes, it is. And this is an insight, and maybe a confession. And I think I share this with many other authors and illustrators, that it's not always your best-selling work that is dearest to you. I have really enjoyed writing and illustrating my own stories. I love that age group, which is just as the reader is sort of maturing from picture books to slightly longer books. I love that transitional
The middle
thing.
grade.
The middle grade,
wow.
Where you get chapters, but they're short chapters and lots of pictures. And that to me is just my happy place. I love that sort of, going there.
I agree.
I had a sort of extraordinary experience as a reader, or rather as a very, very stumbling reader who couldn't quite grasp the rudiments of reading. And my teacher, my parents, they were all saying, when's he going to learn to read? He's a quite slow developer here. And I was quite sort of, worried about this myself, the way you are, you can see other kids are just reading away. And I was thinking, I've got to master this thing. And so to help me, there was this very special thing that my school had. It was a reading scheme. So these little books that would be numbered, and they'd go from 1A to 1B to 1C, and then they would go up the scale, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. As you became more proficient, you would be given, and it was a big thing to go from one to the next one, the next step. So the teacher would say, you've now mastered 1A, you can now move to 1B, and you're doing great, I'm getting there, yeah. And so I was struggling. I'd managed to get to 2C. You know, everyone else racing, I was 2C, I was still, you know, trying to sound out the words. It was a sort of amazing series of books about a little girl called Jane and a little boy called Peter. And they lived with Mummy. I don't know where Daddy was because he was never in the stories. And they would do really exciting things like have tea or play in the garden or maybe go to the shops. You know, these really, you know, heart-stopping adventures that you couldn't wait to see, you know, what would happen.
Big adventures.
I know, amazing. And I would just, you know, struggle through. And I got to 2C. And I remember going into a teacher's classroom and seeing on the desk, the teacher's desk, this extraordinary book. And it was almost, you know, I could feel sort of light coming down sort of from there and illuminating. Yeah. It's like the Holy Grail. And I picked it up and it was Peter and Jane 12C. It was the top of the thing. And I picked it up and looked at it, and there was Peter and there was Jane. They were still having tea with Mummy and, you know, going to the shops and stuff. But there it was in long sentences. And I was holding this extraordinary book in my hand thinking, if only I can get from 2C all the way up to 12C, I'll have mastered this thing called reading. And then I need never read another book again. You know, I'd have done it, you know, I'd have achieved it. And then out of the corner of my eye, I saw another book, and it was just sort of sitting there, and it had a cover by one of my favourite illustrators. I didn't know it then, but Quentin Blake. Okay. It's a gorgeous cover, and it had a man in a top hat with a big moustache, and he was wearing a sort of large coat, and he had a bloodhound with him, and the bloodhound was eating a cream cake, and there was some shady characters running through a wood in the background. It was called Agaton, Sachs and the Jewel Thieves. And I looked at this book and I thought, I wonder what that's about. It's not Peter and Jane, you know, having tea with Mummy. And I opened it and it had pictures. And it had chapters. I thought, oh no, I can't do chapters. But it had these really nice pictures. And I thought, I'll just borrow this book. So I borrowed the book and I started to really painfully read it, you know, as much as I could. But then I had the pictures with me all as I went through. I was thinking, I'm going to find out, you know, and I got all the way through because it had this thing in it. It had this thing called a story. And more than that, had an interesting story that I wanted to find out about. Yeah. And I struggled through. I got to the end. I remember returning the book to the teacher and saying, are there any more of these? And she took me to the library and said, look, there are 10 more Agaton Sachs stories. I borrowed them all. By the end of that summer, I think I was reading, you know, without thinking about it. I was reading because I wanted the stories. And from then, you know, before long, I was reading The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. You know, you couldn't stop me. And then I had that extraordinary moment where the teacher said, well, of course, you're reading ages. And then she gave me some huge, I thought, really? How did that happen? So it's this extraordinary thing, I think, for me, the connection between words and pictures. It was very visceral. It was my formative experience and started me off on my journey. And so when I came to sort of, you know, think about what I wanted to do myself, when I sort of, you know, was going to write stories and things, I thought, well, what I really want to do is like a book about really disgusting space aliens with like horrible tentacles and, you know, stuff sort of, you know, dripping around and a little description. And I remember taking that to the publisher and they looked at it and going, really? Really? Do you have any other ideas? And I said, well, I've got an idea about a little girl who lives with this sort of small hairy creature in an apartment. And I said, oh, we like that. Why don't you do that? I said, okay. So I did these books called the Ottoline books, and I loved them, and it was great fun doing them. And I got to the end of sort of 3 of these books, and they said to me, do you have any other ideas? And I said, well, I've got this idea for like these really disgusting aliens with like bug eyes, and they're going to do all this with claw. So yeah, do you have any other ideas? And I said, well, I've got an idea about, like, Lord Byron had a daughter called Ada, who he didn't sort of see, but, you know, I loved that sort of the whole history of that. And I said, well, I could write this story about this lord with a daughter he doesn't see. And it all came out of this idea that someone had said about Lord Byron. One of his ex-girlfriends had said, you know, Lord Byron was mad, bad and dangerous to know. And it was a great sort of, you know, because he was a sort of very bad one. And I thought, that's fun. And in my head, I love a good pun. And I remember thinking, if I create a character like this, he could live in this big country house. And I'd give him a daughter, and I'd call the daughter Ada after. And he could live in this big house, and maybe the house could be decorated, the grounds of the gardens could be decorated with lots of these little statues of garden gnomes and things, because maybe he invented the garden gnome as a feature in gardens. So he'd have a collection. And then because he's very sort of Byronic and full of himself, maybe when he composes his poems, he could ride a very early bicycle, you know, the ones without pedals, which were wonderfully called hobby horses. And I thought, that'd be fun. He could have a stable for his hobby horses. And he could ride this. And then as he passed these statues, maybe he could have an old-fashioned musket of some sort, and he could just, you know, take pot shots at the statues, maybe blow a head off of a garden gnome. And then it came to, he could have a reputation for being mad, bad and dangerous to gnomes. And I remember pitching that to the people, and they're going, oh, what a joke. But anyway, you write that, not the aliens, write that one. And so I wrote the Goth Girl books and had just great fun. Yeah. Mainly, I liked to try and confound my Italian translator with the references. So my favourite was, I remember she phoned me up and said, you have written, I'm going to do a very bad accent, forgive me, but she said, you've done this a character, and I'm not quite sure what he's about, you know. And he was a sort of watercolourist. And I said, oh yes. She said, and what are the references? And I said, well, there was you know, a famous watercolourist who did various other things during the. I said, oh yes, now I get that. And then there's a part of England, you know, that I've named him after. So he was called Romney Marsh, and he had, you know, named after George Romney, the famous watercolourist. Okay. Romney Marsh is an area of England, you know, where it's sort of, you know, down on the south coast. So he's named after that. And I said, also, I was thinking of an echo of a QPR centre forward, a sort of footballer of the 1970s called Rodney Marsh.
Okay, perfect.
You know, how you translate that into, for an Italian audience, I have no idea. But that was the sort of things I like to sort of set out for her.
She did it in a clever way.
I'm sure she did.
Absolutely.
She amazed me what she did to those books. And so then, you know, I'd finished these books, and I went into the pub. She said, do you have any ideas? And I said, well, I do have this idea about, you know, aliens. And they said, well, all right then. Finally wore them down. And so I did. I had so much material by this time, we decided to put them into 2 books. That's possibly a mistake, but we did 2 books. And the first one was called Alienography, How to Spot an Alien Invasion and What to Do About It. Yeah. It's full of these disgusting alien creatures and stuff, and it had all sorts of things, get pop-ups, and very expensive book, the way they did it. And then we did a follow-up called Alienography, Tips for Tiny Tyrants. Again, that sort of thing, all sorts of stuff going on. It didn't set the publishing world alight. It did okay, but they were so expensive to produce, like some of these Hollywood films, you know, they're too expensive to then continue. And so we didn't do any more. And I had these 2 books, and you can't really see them around very often. You see Ottoline and Goth Girl everywhere, but my alienography books are very special. And whenever I see someone with a copy of Alien, I want to hug them. You know, it's that sort of. So, you know, very special to my heart, these books. And sometimes it is that way, that the books that you love more than other ones that no one else has got any time for. You know, it's one of those things. And I don't mind that. I think that's part of the whole sort of, you know, why, you know we need to sort of earn a living, we need to, you know, to progress in our careers, but every so often there's that book that you'll always love. Nobody cares for it. but you love it. So my answer, very long answer, is alienography. I love that. And then I was asked, I like to think this was the legacy of alienography, but I was asked whether I would like to illustrate the wonderful Douglas Adams Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I thought, funny. Of course I would, because he was the inspiration.
The whale.
Oh, complete. And then when I started to work with Neil Gaiman, one of the great pleasures was that Neil and Douglas were great friends. And there was that lovely, in fact, Neil sort of interviewed Douglas.
Yeah, it was my next question was about...
And that was such a lovely connection. So I've got sort of two things in the sense to thank alienography for, sort of, meeting Neil and working with him, but also that connection with Douglas. And the wonderful pleasure of now illustrating The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I thought, a little bit like Alice in Wonderland, if you illustrate, a classic like that, of course, the publisher is contractually obliged to offer the next book through the looking glass to you. You can't do one and not the other. Yeah. So they had to make, whether they liked it or not, they had to ask me to do through the looking glass. It seems to be working with Douglas. So I'm hoping that, in fact, it's coming true. The second book, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, they've just asked whether I'd illustrate that.
There are 4.
There are 4. This is my plan. Yeah. If there are if I only get to do 2, you'll know it's been a disaster. But I'm hoping I'll get to do the other 2.
Good. On the origin of stories, writer Brian Boyd does an extraordinary observation. The oldest tales of humanity, myths and legend, are all children's tales. Mainly because by the time you reached 20, you were on the brink of death. What do you think about this?
Well, it's true, is what I think. I mean, that's extraordinary, isn't it? That idea of sort of longevity and in a sense, the way that stories are passed on. Sort of they begin and then are passed on generationally. And I imagine, sort of you're a Minoan, living in Crete in sort of, the 6th century BC. You're probably right, you're not going to live much beyond sort of 30. Yeah. So, by the time you're sort of 18, you're in your prime, and 25, you're beginning to think, I'm past it, so it's
old age.
It's a little bit like, the career of pop stars, you get to a certain point, that's it. Unless you're the Rolling Stones and then you're Olympian gods that go on forever. I think essentially, the kernel of truth in that, in a sense, is that the imagination of the child is so fertile. And for all of us, what we do is we are encountering concepts, ideas for the first time. Yeah. And so when I write for children, I'm often, when I sort of put certain things into books, and I do like puns, and I do like sort of to be playful with certain concepts, but I realise so much of what I do, my readers will be encountering for the first time. So what might seem to me like a bit of a tired old cliche, well, actually, my readers are going to find, this in time. And I need to remind myself of that sometimes, because we're in the studio now, my studio where I work, and it's where I like to come when I'm going to create my classic and much loved and very beautiful work, my stories. This is where I weave the magic, you see, and it's very special. And what I like to do is to, come down here. Usually, I'm not wearing it now, but as I say, I'm a cosplayer. I like to wear my sort of Byronic shirt, one of those big linen, open to the navel, possibly with huge sort of capacious sleeves and ruffles. And I can come down here and possibly with a candelabra. I can bring my candle and light the candles, so there's candlelight. Have my beautiful sort of manuscript paper and my quill pen, possibly a skull that I can use as an inkwell. Yeah. And at midnight, usually midnight's a good time for the ideas to flow. A large goblet of something I can refresh myself with, and then write in the midnight hour, these brilliant things.
10 minutes.
Just when inspiration strikes, it strikes. And then, so I've done this so often. I've written something in the sort of, depths of the night, full of inspiration. And then the next day, I've come in to the studio, I'd seen what I'd been working on, and I've looked at it and I thought, what was I thinking? What is this? Oh my goodness. And what I do is I don't discard ideas in that way, throw them away or burn them or whatever. What I have is, sort of behind me here is a set of architect's drawers,
Yep.
you know, the shallow, big sort of drawers that you can fill with artwork and stuff. So all those drawers are full of the work I've done over the years. You know, they're getting very full. I've now had to sort of move up into this sort of mezzanine up there. There's an extra little another archive. I'm surrounded by stuff.
You keep everything,
Yep. I don't throw things away, but what I do have is the very bottom drawer is what I call the naughty drawer. And in that drawer are these terrible ideas I've had. I put them away. Aliens lived there for quite a long time. Yeah. They were there, and what happens is, like mushrooms, in the dark, they just slowly grow. And every so often, maybe once every sort of 3 years or so, I will go and open the naughty drawer and have a look, and I'll think, you know, three-breasted mermaids. No, the time's not right yet. No, the world's not ready for that. I'll put that away. Look at the interesting alien. I thought, well, actually, maybe.
That's the time.
Yeah, and so it's that sort of feeling in a way that, of course, there are terrible ideas, but there are also ideas whose time hasn't come yet. And so keep things, I say, you know, and somewhere have your own naughty drawer. Keep them. You never know; things can come back.
I saw that. So, among your many honors, you have been awarded 3 times with the Kate Greenaway Medal. Kate Greenaway was an illustrator of the Victorian age. Yeah, she was. Yeah, you became Children Laureate from 15 to 17. Yeah, and now you are Officer of the Order of the British Empire.
Yes.
Oh, what a pressure. So how important are these titles to you, and what they change about your life, if they change something or not?
Well, this is retrospective, isn't it? I remember being nominated for the Kate Greenaway Medal, which for an illustrator, before that, I was nominated a few times for the Greenaway onto the shortlist. It's that feeling for us as illustrators, British illustrators. It's our Oscars, you see, and just like the Oscars, you have this really difficult sort of performance you have to go through when you're nominated, and you go along to the award ceremony, and you've got to compose your face while the nomination is read out, you know, and people say nice things about you, and you've got to look humble but proud. You've got to look as if, no, really, I don't believe a word of this at all, but I really do. You know, and it's very
proud of the nomination.
Hard sort of thing to do. And more than that, when you don't win, and you get sort of someone else wins, you've got to look happy for them. And that's the hardest acting job ever. You know, I don't know how the Hollywood people do it, but you've got to somehow, you know. And so I've been through this a few times with a number of books. And, you know, that feeling of deflation and that feeling of, well, it doesn't matter. Prizes don't matter. And they don't, I don't think, in that way. But boy, do we love them. And there's that feeling of, validation you get. Yeah. And I remember getting to a point where I was thinking, look, I'm just going to have to reconcile myself to just never winning any of these things. I must move on, that's fine. Don't worry about it. And of course then, you know, I got nominated and I won. And I thought, wow, you know. And there was this medal. It's an actual sort of gold medal in a jewelry case. And I thought, this was wonderful, you know, and I sort of treasured it. And then I won sort of quite a few years, because it was done. That was fine. I had no issues anymore. I felt validated. I need never sort of, you know, revisit that again. And then, of course, you know, a few years later, I was nominated again, and then I won this second medal, by which time I was thinking, no, please. No, but you know, delighted, and I had this. And then I did an extraordinary book with Neil Gaiman, which really wasn't meant to be a book at all. It was one of his sort of short stories that he had published in a collection of writings. And I remember sort of reading it and rather enjoying it. And then my publisher said, well, why don't we turn this into a book? And it's a very short story. And they said, we'll give you 96 pages. And I thought, oh, right, okay. So I sort of designed this thing over sort of 96 pages. And it's the sort of fairy tale that became The Sleeper and the Spindle. Okay. And it's an extraordinary thing because it's a sort of picture book for young adults, I would say.
Yeah.
Who knew there was such a thing, but apparently, that's what it became. And Neil is such a wizard in a way that he just, in my mind, I've got this mental image that Neil is a sort of Gandalf figure. He's Neil the Wise, he's in his pointy hat and his grey cloak and stuff, and he visits the Shire from time to time, and I just happen to be sitting outside my spherical sort of house with my round window and my front door, and Neil's there, I'm minding my own business, and he says, do you want to come on an adventure? And of course I say, yes, I'd love to, and I saddle up my pony and I follow him wherever he leads me. And that's, The Sleeper and the Spindle for me was that sort of thing. It came out of nowhere. It was a wonderful adventure. I loved it. And then lo and behold, it won the Greenaway for the third time. And then the pressure sort of started to mount because no one had won 3 times. So I felt a little bit embarrassed by that because I didn't mean to. I didn't, it just happened. It was a bit of an accident, but lovely. And so I remember, sort of afterwards feeling this, as you do, imposter syndrome, sort of honestly, they've made a mistake, but they're mine now, I'm not giving them back, they're my precious. And so when I sort of, have moments of self-doubt, and I'm not proud to sort of reveal this, but in the sort of dark of the night, maybe after the candles have been extinguished and I've gone to bed, I'll sometimes just go over to this little shelf, and there are the medals lined up on a and I'll blow the dust off and just gently stroke them, just quietly, and then put them away. So that's the validation I need, and then I need never tell anyone. Now, aware I'm telling you, but
nobody.
It's my little treasure in a way. There they are. And when I became, they asked me to become children's laureate. They had asked me sort of before, and I'd sort of been a little too busy, and also was suffering from the sense of, who the hell do I think I am? I'm not this person to go around being representative in that way. But the final time they asked, I went to a conference about school libraries, a wonderful organisation called the School Library Association, and they had a prize for librarians, and a whole range of librarians were coming along, and they were sort of revealing the best school libraries, and they were giving medals out to each. And I remember looking at this extraordinary community of librarians who I've always loved, from childhood, my great experiences, as with Neil actually, great experiences being in libraries and in school libraries, particularly for me. And I remember thinking, if they ask me to become Children's Laureate again, they probably won't, but if they do, and they decide they would like me to, I will accept, because what I would like to do as Children's Laureate is talk about libraries. Just because it's a great platform, you get to sort of meet people and talk about things, and so I thought that's what I'll do. If they, and about a year later they asked me, and I said, well, yes, I'd love to. So what I didn't realise until the ceremony is they actually give you a medal for being Children's Laureate.
With a chain?
Yeah, I'm an actual medal, because my Greenaways sit in little boxes. The laureate is a real medal on a ribbon. You can hang it around your neck. And I was thinking, oh, this is a step up. This is a whole new thing. Very excited by that. And I told a friend of mine who is German, and she was terribly excited for me. Very excited, and she sent me a little message, and she said, "I'm so excited, Chris, that you've become the children's laundrette." And that was just what I needed, because I thought, yes, actually, I'm
children's laundrette.
I am the children's laundrette. Any sort of librarian with any sort of washing they need doing.
Yeah.
Give it to me. I'll put it through the rinse.
Soap and great.
Perfect sort of, take the wind out of my sails in case I feel too grand. But it was an absolute privilege to do that.
Yeah.
And I think for me, in a sense, things like the Greenaway, things like the laureate thing, it's about honouring the community that actually, sort of
serve.
Yeah,
in
completely. The Greenaway is bestowed by librarians, my favourite people. Mm-hmm. The laureateship is all about children's literature, the thing I care deeply about. And that is sort of, it's wonderful to have treasures, sort of around the place to go and consult. But the treasures can be anything in a way. Mm-hmm. One of my great treasures is a little plastic figure of Stitch from the movie Lilo and Stitch. Mm-hmm. That comes from a Happy Meal sometime in the 1990s, a McDonald's Happy Meal that I bought for my children. And I liked it so much I stole it. That sits on my shelf. So that's almost as important. I have a little sort of, group of things. I think many illustrators do these little sort of things that we keep in our workplace. Yeah. Yes.
Great. Can you tell me your perfect day? It's a day in which you work or maybe not? Because for me, it is. And my wife every time says, but you're working.
Interesting, as you asked me that question, in my head I've got Lou Reed singing Perfect Day. I know that's a song about something very different, but which is not my perfect day. My perfect day it would need to be a Wednesday, midweek, because, stuff's going on. It's not the beginning of the week, it's not the end of the week, which has its own sort of vibe. It's not a Sunday evening, that's different. It's Wednesday, this unregarded middle of the week. And it needs to be overcast. There could be maybe wintry, autumnal. There needs to be a sort of drizzle. It's got to be a really sort of, one of those dreary days. Okay. No nice weather at all. It's got to be one of those days where the light is very grey, so that in the studio I have to turn the lights on at like midday. It's that gloomy, so a really gloomy Wednesday, maybe an afternoon, where you have to turn the light on at midday, because I find that incredibly cozy. That idea, being here in my studio on a gloomy day with turning the lights on and starting to, and working on illustrating something, drawing a picture of something, whatever I'm working on. Just an entire sort of day with the radio on, maybe some classical music playing as I draw with and dip my pen in the ink and scratch on the paper and listen to something beautiful on the radio, while doctors are answering emergency calls, ambulance drivers are doing the teachers are dealing with unruly classes, policemen are keeping law and order, all the real adult people are out there doing adult things and making the world work. And I'm here on a grey Wednesday afternoon with my light on in my seat, drawing things from my imagination, just quietly getting on with it. Nobody knows I'm here. It's just this solipsistic sort of place that I've built around me. And then the end to my perfect day, after a day of work of drawing endlessly, what I would do as in my perfect day, return to my house along my garden path. That lovely thing. I love walking down my garden path from my studio at the end of the garden. I like to imagine a neighbour looking out of their window and seeing this man emerge from the bottom of his garden, because my studio is screened by trees, so there's just the garden path, and someone seeing me walk down the garden path and thinking to themselves, I wonder what that man's been doing at the bottom of his garden all this time. I just like that mystery. And then walking into my house, great commute down the garden path, going back into my house, sitting down, reaching for a sketchbook, opening it up and just drawing. Something that's the perfect ending to my perfect day. Drawing and drawing. And the reason is that I never quite know when I'm working and when I'm not working. So there's no distinction between sitting at my desk, drawing something that someone's asked me to do, or sitting on my sofa after a long day's work, drawing just for myself. The two are indivisible. So I'm either working all the time or I'm never working. I'm not sure. That's a philosophical question for a Chinese emperor. Maybe I'm dreaming I'm an emperor and I'm a butterfly. Maybe I'm a butterfly dreaming I'm an emperor. I'm an illustrator dreaming I'm an illustrator. It's a confusing Freudian sort of answer to your question.
What is the difference, if any, between being a painter and being a children illustrator? For example, Bill Watterson, the cartoonist of Calvin and Hobbes, stopped making comics and became a painter. Andy Warhol, on the other hand, began his career by drawing 6 books for the best children books. And then he became Warhol. What do you want to do when you grow up?
Yes, that's a very good question. I am at this stage in my career where exactly that question is a perfect one to ask me. I think that actually you get to a certain stage, I think, where what you're doing, is great. You've got to where you want to be, and you're looking for another challenge. So I can understand Bill Watson with his beautiful Calvin and Hobbes. We all wish he would continue forever, but he just decided he got to a certain point, he was now going to paint. I love that idea. Andy Warhol, going the other way, sort of saw the commerciality of what we do, always someone to sort of spot a trend, spot how to do things. He explored, the work of a children's book illustrator, illustrated many shoes for catalogues and things, but then turned that into this extraordinary sort of career. So I can see both sides of it. Now for me, this is, an exclusive, I've got to say for you, that I'm not sure the world needs many more books from me. I've loved doing the Ottoline books. I've loved doing Goth Girl. I've loved illustrating for Neil Gaiman. I've loved the work that I'd done with my longtime collaborator Paul Stewart, that we did many books of in a fancy genre. That's all been wonderful. And I loved illustrating classics. Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass, wonderful things to do. I've just finished illustrating The Little Prince, which for me, in a sense, it's going to get me excluded from France forever. Yeah. I've committed a heinous act, but I had to because I love that book so much. Yeah. For me, that's almost a good point at which to do one of these life-changing transitions. And so one aspect of that is I want to become an extremely bad painter. I'm going to do this in the medium of egg tempera because I love that, playing around with that. You get to paint on board, I like that. So it takes very tiny brush strokes, so I can imagine myself spending a long time. Don't know what I'm going to do, something terrible, but I'll do it in egg tempera. So that's the first part. Now the second part of my grand plan is I'm going to do a sort of final book. And I'm contracted to do 3 more books at Macmillan and another couple at another publisher. Once I finish that,
5.
Yes, it's a little bit to go yet, but once that's done, I'm going to go away and work on this very particular book. I'm not going to have a contract for it. I'm not going to show my publishers. I'm not going to say anything about it, apart from what I'm about to tell you now, which is it's going to be, and this was described to me by my German friend, she described this as the vast book that makes no sense and nobody's asked for. So that's the working title. That's what I'm going to be doing.
It's a very good title.
It's going to be enormous. It's going to be one of those books, that you find in an airport and you've got to pick up with both hands, that sort of thing. It's going to promise hours and hours of reading. You're not going to read this quickly. It's going to be set in an imaginary world From my childhood. I had this strange obsession with two invented islands when I was about 8. And I would invent people who lived there and what they did. And so 2 islands. Now, I've long since discarded any of the childish notes and stuff I've done, so this is just a memory. But they are 2 islands, so I'm going to be telling that story. I have a wonderful French notebook. It's a red cloth-bound notebook. It's a quarter full of, quite frankly, deranged notes about these 2 imaginary islands. At the moment, it's just notes on one island, the other one's still to come. Halfway through, it's got a bookmark. Halfway through, I've marked it. One side's going to be one island, the next is the other. It's full, everything you need to know, food, lifestyles, who lives there, what they do, how they interact, all that is going to be contained in this red notebook. I'm going to write it over this summer. Well, with summer's over, into next summer. At the end of which, when this is full, I'm going to sit down. I've got a pen that I bought specially, a Pilot pen, a fountain pen. I'm going to sit, I've got my notebooks that I've pre-bought, lots of them from my favourite stationer, C. White of Brighton. Best notebooks in the world because they actually have paper covers that you can draw on. They invite you to draw on them, not like my exercise books at school. And I'm going to fill this stuff up with an outpouring of who knows what onto the pages of this book. It's going to go on and on and on, and the only person who is going to see it or even read it will be my wife. She is contractually obliged to listen to this chapter by chapter over the next however many years it's going to take. She's going to have to listen to it, and we will have a safe word. It's always important. The safe word will be burn this. Never tell anyone about this story. So that I'm relying on her judgment, and that's what I will be doing. That's what I want to do next.
That's a good plan.
Who knows where it'll end? And if you never ever hear of this book ever, you will know that it's probably up in a sort of smoke at the bottom of my garden. There'll be a bonfire on a Wednesday, drizzly Wednesday.
Not a barbecue.
Possibly a braai.
A braai. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.